with increasing campus crackdowns and government crackdowns on pro-Palestinian expression, suddenly they are against censorship. But unfortunately, there's too much on the other side. People who are very much against the cancel culture and the suppressing of libertarian and conservative views are not so bothered about excessive punishment views that happen to be against their own political beliefs.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Babylon Cast. As always, I'm your host, Vern, accompanied alongside my co-host and good friend, Bruce. Bruce, how are you doing today?
I'm very excited because we have a fantastic guest coming on, someone who's been spoken of very, very highly by mutual friends of ours, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation we're about to have.
Likewise, today we are joined by the ever-prestigious Nadine Strossen. She is an American legal scholar and civil liberties activist, served as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, from 1991 to 2008, and in fact was the first woman, actually, to lead the ACLU. She is the John Marshall Harlan Professor of Law Emerita at New York Law School and is a senior fellow with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions, FIRE. And she is also the author of many books, including most recently and the topic of conversation, The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail, which she wrote alongside Greg Lukianoff. So, Ms. Strossen, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I hope we can be on a first name basis, Bruce and Vern. I'm very honored to be on your podcast and to follow in the footsteps of some of my free speech heroes, including John Rauch, about whom we were speaking beforehand.
Oh, the honor is absolutely all ours, and we are very excited to have you on because of all the things that we talk about on this channel. We talk about politics and civilization within the context of politics, and one of the things that we've always touched on or discussed is this concept of freedom of speech, because it seems like who you're defending freedom of speech for or in favor of really just depends on what year it is. It seems like every other year it's just a different side that's defending freedom of speech. And
or in fairness, it depends on what state you're in, because the speech that's censored and therefore needs defending is speech that is unpopular. And speech that is unpopular in Florida is different from, in certain parts of Florida, is very different from speech that's unpopular, let's say, in Manhattan, New York City.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just depending on where you are, what year it is, who you're speaking to, really just depends on how people's attitudes towards free speech is. And what I like about your book is that it identifies 10 pretty common arguments against free speech. And I would argue probably some of the strongest ones that I've come across, or at least the ones, that are employed by academics the most. And your book tries to focus on it. And one of the interesting things within the conversation about free speech is that people usually compartmentalize it into separate sections. So you have people who talk about freedom of speech within the context of freedom from coercion from the government. The government can't dictate what it is that you can and can't say. They can't challenge the press in trying to tell them that they shouldn't publish something that's against the president, or at least they shouldn't be trying to do that. Then there's also like the civil side of it where, well, what if it's a private company? And we will get into that later on in the episode, but also people just discuss it within the context of private companies, right? Even though a private company might not necessarily legally have to be forced to enforce freedom of speech, should we harbor that type of culture where it's okay or it's expected that they would be doing that? But I want to open it up by asking you, what kind of prompted you to start writing this book in the current year, 2025? Was there a particular argument against freedom of speech that you saw pervasive? Or, who is this book written for? Were there some arguments that are pernicious enough and popular enough that you guys felt like we need you and Greg, we need to start writing this book because it's still incredibly important to write a book about free speech?
Well, first of all, thank you for that really knowledgeable introduction, Vern. You packed a lot into it, and I'm glad we're going to get to go back and revisit, because the points that you made, I think, are not known by the vast majority of the public. And a lot of the problems with lack of support for free speech trace back to ignorance about free speech. So that's the overwhelming problem that both Greg and I, as full-time free speech advocates, kept encountering. And this book actually originated quite a few years ago when both of us, as a result of speaking constantly and constantly encountering the same questions and the same arguments over and over again. And if I can add one comment to your amendment or addition to your great introduction, Vern, the arguments that we address in our book are not only coming from academics, they're coming from politicians, they're coming from members of the public, they're coming from journalists and, students and faculty members, citizens, people that you would hope in our democratic republic were knowledgeable about free speech, but actually show a great deal of ignorance. In fact, a lot of government officials, I think a majority of them, are graduates of law schools, and yet they will make completely inaccurate statements about the First Amendment, such as hate speech is not free speech. Greg and I both arrived at the conclusion that we were constantly answering the same questions and arguments over and over and over again. And both of us love it. I mean, we never get tired of the opportunity to educate and persuade people about the importance of free speech and also how common sense the principles actually are, as opposed to the distorted misconceptions that are usually attacked in kind of a caricatured version of what free speech actually is. But we had the idea that we should also concretize our answers to these familiar arguments in writing, not instead of continuing to address them orally, but we don't have, much as both of us speak, we do not have the opportunity to reach as large an audience through speaking as hopefully we can reach through the written word. And we had both independently started writing our answers to what each of us considered to be the most common arguments. We found that we agreed on what the most common arguments were and which ones were the most serious and worthy of being responded to in a very serious way. And interestingly enough, although our views are essentially identical, our answers are really quite different because there's a lot that one can say in defense of free speech and explaining it. And so I really enjoyed reading Greg's answers because they complemented mine and expanded my own understanding. And in fact, at one point we thought it would be really fun to invite some of our other free speech colleagues, Jakob Bichangama we mentioned, and some others, and I'm sure that we could have an even richer book, but it would be long, and one of our goals was to make it relatively short.
Well, Jacob Bichangama's book was definitely a long read, but it was your book was an excellent parallel to his. I read that to get a comprehensive history of the genesis of free speech, Milton's Curse, and everything I wanted to know about is impacting that book. And your more recent book gave excellent answers to the most common arguments against free speech.
But Bruce, if I can interject, and this goes back to Vern's point, from reading Jakob's book, which by the way is called Free Speech, a global history from Socrates to social media. And it really covers free speech controversies around the world and throughout history, going back to ancient times, every culture, every society, every form of government. And I'm sure you recognize that the same arguments surface in every context. So, to your question, Vern, are these new arguments? No, they're not new arguments. In fairness, I have to say the responses are also not particularly new. We try to explain them in ways that we hope will be persuasive to a contemporaneous audience. But I think basically this has been an eternal dialectic among human beings, tension between, it's part of the broader tension between the search for individual liberty on the one hand and control and authority on the other hand.
Yes, and which is why it's so frustrating to speak against some of these common arguments in this very very fraught age we're in which we have a polarized political system that thrives on one side, assuming the worst intent of the other. I have a question for you that I've been struggling with a response to in an eloquent fashion. Now, I've criticized the left as a progressive myself. I've criticized the left in the past for an inconsistent and selective application of liberal values, but as it's 2025 now, and we have a far more substantial pushback to wokeism. But what I've noticed more and more of is even on the moderately progressive side now, again, as we spoke of even before this conversation began, is like this is to how little the people who claim to fight for these liberal values actually understand them. And unfortunately, free speech really isn't an exception. One of the most disappointing things I've noticed in the last few years is like the quote unquote supposedly principled are now stating you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. It drives me nuts. Um, now, from what I understood, I tried to do some research as to where this statement come from, and my understanding was it was uttered by Oliver Wendell Holmes to enforce legal actions against Charles Schenck and his wife when they were mailing U.S. soldiers, stating that their civil rights had been violated during the draft during World War One. And Justice Holmes stated that if there was quote unquote evil that the Supreme Court had the power to defend against, even if it sounds words, then they were obligated to do so. But he later recanted this. Unfortunately, it's become one of those cultural memes that's so quick that people are so easy to quick and draw from. If someone needs a quick and easy way of cutting out someone else's free speech rights, to their social and political opponents. Now, I've tried to point this out, but I don't think I can do it justice the way you and Greg can. So I wanted to. I was hoping you might be able to help me formulate an answer as to why the quote unquote fire in a crowded theater argument is a fallacy. Why is this statement such a poor argument against free speech?
Excellent question. And that's one of the, as you say, it's so common. It's just trotted out routinely. And that's why it's one of the arguments that Greg and I respond to. But let me first respond to the introductory point that you made before you posed that specific question, Bruce, which is the frustration about the inconsistency of not only liberals and progressives, but just about everybody, certainly including conservatives, all across the ideological spectrum, people tend to support freedom of speech for me, but not for thee.
Yes.
And one day they will be defending, fighting against censorship because it's people whose views they share who are being censored, but then the political powers change and suddenly they're for censorship. And we've certainly seen that recently when, unfortunately, and it goes both ways. A lot of campus progressives and other folks to the left of center who said, oh, there are no free speech problems on campus, and free speech is only a tool of the wealthy and the powerful and conservatives and white supremacists. After October 7th, with increasing campus crackdowns and government crackdowns on pro-Palestinian expression, suddenly you get, which tends to align with people on the left hand of the political spectrum, suddenly they are against censorship and in favor of free speech in a way that we didn't see before. But conversely, and I'm making generalizations, obviously there are exceptions, but unfortunately there's too much on the other side, people who are very much against the cancel culture and the suppressing of libertarian and conservative views on campus, and against censoring of pro-Israel views, are not so bothered about excessive punishment, unwarranted punishment of views about the war in Gaza that happen to be against their own political beliefs. So I think human beings are consistently inconsistent. And the reason is that I think, and I know this through my decades of working with the ACLU and leading the ACLU, which is always neutrally defending all fundamental freedoms for all people, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, you're entitled to certain fundamental rights. And FIRE does the same thing, focusing specifically on free speech. But most people will not understand the underlying principle. They will look at the particular speaker and the particular message, and to cite a famous or infamous case that the ACLU handled defending freedom of speech for Skokie, Illinois. Many people know about this case in the late 1970s. They'll say, how can you defend the Nazis? And today, FIRE is getting a lot of criticism from some supporters when we're defending free speech rights for students who simply were, or faculty members from overseas who were simply, criticizing certain government policies. How can you defend terrorists? Not understanding that what is being defended is a principle, not how the particular speaker takes advantage of that principle or that right. We're not defending the message. We're defending the right of the individual to choose the message and the right of audience members to choose to listen to it, or for that matter, to choose not to listen to it. And so I cannot stress that point enough, Bruce. And part of the task of advocates, and I think Greg and I did that consistently in our answers to these questions, is to give concrete examples that will make people understand why their advocacy of certain kinds of censorship is going to come back and bite them and undermine the very ideas that they themselves passionately support. Now, I'm getting a little bit beyond your particular question, but let me give one really important example, which is hate speech. Everybody hates hate speech. And again, as I said earlier, many politicians and others who should know better will make these completely inaccurate statements. Hate speech is not free speech. Well, the reason why the Supreme Court has never recognized a category of speech that's defined by its hateful messages and said, therefore, it's not protected constitutionally, is because that is such an inherently irretrievably, necessarily subjective concept. What one person hates, somebody else loves. And so people who self-confidently say, oh, let's get rid of hate speech, think that means, well, what we consider to be racist speech or sexually discriminatory speech or so forth, without understanding that other people have a diametrically different view. And one example I like to give is Black Lives Matter advocacy, which has been attacked as hate speech, seriously attacked by government officials and others, as that's hate speech against white people, it's hate speech against police officers. Very important general point about the answer to any flimsy argument or common argument. And now let me get to this specific flimsy common argument that you raised, Bruce, which is, first of all, misquoting what Oliver Wendell Holmes actually said and the way you paraphrased it. And it's very significant. The way you paraphrased it is the way 99.99% of the time it is misstated, including a few years ago, I did a panel with Stephen Breyer, who was then a justice on the Supreme Court. I admire him greatly, and he's written some great free speech opinions, but people tend to be sloppy about this, and he misstated it as well. So most people say, as you did, Bruce, that freedom of speech does not protect the right to shout fire in a crowded theater. No, it does not protect the right to falsely shout fire in a theater. The word crowded doesn't appear either, and cause a panic. And those elements are incredibly important to explain the actual concept there, because you may suppress speech if it is going to imminently cause great harm. cause a panic. If, on the other hand, in the particular factual circumstance, that very same message is actually going to save lives because the theater really is on fire, then the safest thing you can do to protect human life and safety and well-being is to shout fire. So what Holmes was capturing is what is often called the emergency principle. It complements something else that the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of free speech, the viewpoint neutrality principle. Government may never suppress speech solely because of disagreement with or disapproval, dislike of the viewpoint, the content, the idea. So you can't just look at, this theater is on fire in the abstract and punish it. You have to look at it in its overall context. And the contextual concept is if in the particular facts and circumstances, that message directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific serious harm, causing a panic, then and only then may you restrict the speech. But if you disagree with the idea, or you think that the idea has a looser, more speculative, indirect connection to some potential harm in the future, you can't censor it on that basis. To quote another line from Oliver Wendell Holmes, he said, "Every idea is an incitement." And by that, he didn't mean, therefore, let's censor every idea. He meant exactly the opposite. The fact that anything you say might lead to bad consequences, but that can't be enough of a justification for punishing speech, or we would have literally no free speech at all. So you need this tight and direct connection between the speech and a specific harm in the particular circumstances. And unfortunately, at the time, the majority of the Supreme Court did not enforce the emergency principle. They enforced something called the bad tendency approach, which said, well, as long as speech has a bad tendency, it might indirectly, perhaps at some future time, lead to harm. It can be punished. And not surprisingly, people who write, from the left perspective, the communists or the socialists that were involved in that case, or they were also critics of World War I, which was extremely unpopular. And basically, this is why I find it particularly ironic that people from the left recently have been so supportive of censorship, because history shows that, they've usually been in the minority, and their voices are the ones that have been suppressed over and over and over again under the loose bad tendency test. I've mentioned the anarchists and socialists, labor organizers, advocates for civil rights, advocates for civil liberties, for reproductive freedom, LGBTQ rights. All of those were subject to censorship under the loose bad tendency test.
I see.
One of the things that I'm worried about is that I think
I'm sorry, Vern. I'm going to get back to Bruce because you said I see, but you frowned. So I think you have a follow-up question. You're still frowning. You're still frowning.
It wasn't necessarily a follow-up question. It's like I've heard many statements that are trying to dismantle Oliver Wendell Holmes's "you can't shout fire in a crowded theater." But this is the first time I've ever heard of ideas like the emergency principle or the Oliver Wendell Holmes stating that any idea can be a potential incitement. Now that just gives me some context I've never seen before. So it's kind of like I have that light bulb moment when it comes on in my head. It's like, wow, okay, now that gives me some incredible context that I wasn't aware of before, and that goes to show you how my level of ignorance on this subject. But that was just an incredibly insightful answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the question, and it's really hard to reduce it to a short answer, which is part of the challenge, I think, for those of us who defend any abstract principles.
Yeah.
It's much easier, like the soundbite people can remember, you shouting fire in a crowded theater. It's so far away from the reality, and it's very hard to explain the reality in less than a soundbite. Another good example is flag burning, which has been a recurrent controversy throughout my adult lifetime, and it's recently come back. And I remember when the Supreme Court first held that laws criminalizing or making illegal the burning of the American flag in political protests. The Supreme Court struck that down in 1989, I believe, thereabouts, and that was so amazingly unpopular. The very next day, the then President George H.W. Bush gave a speech in which he called for a constitutional amendment. And in very rapid succession, 3/4 of the states voted to ratify that. Congress passed it by the required, Congress proposed the constitutional amendment. It immediately got 2/3 of the votes in the House of Representatives, and 3/4 of the states ratified. And ultimately, we came within one vote of the 2/3 supermajority required in the Senate as well. I mean, we came that close to amending the Constitution to overturn the Supreme Court's decision. Anyway, many members of Congress, I was then president of the ACLU and lobbying in Congress against this constitutional amendment. And so many of them said, we cannot vote against it because, the political ads are phrased in terms of soundbite. My opponent supports burning the American flag. And, you can't answer that in an equivalently short soundbite. And so I understood the political pressures, but we have a challenge for that reason. It requires getting people to have the curiosity that you have, Bruce, to go a little bit beyond the sound bites.
Yes.
I'm worried. I think one of the things that makes defending freedom of speech so difficult is that it seems as if freedom of speech has a big PR problem, where it's so much easier to convince someone that speech should be curtailed in some sense, either hate speech or speech that can be disinformation, because it's so easy, as you were saying earlier, to show clips of someone saying some horrible stuff. I read what was it? The Case Against Free Speech, I think by P.E. Moskowitz was his name. I remember reading the book. It was about a year ago. I don't think I'm misrepresenting their argument, but they were presenting the Skokie case that you had mentioned earlier, of he's marching down a very predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and how the ACLU came to the defense of on behalf of the principle of freedom of speech. And their argument, and I'm pretty confident I'm not mischaracterizing it. I'm pretty confident this was how it went over, because overall the premise of the book was, freedom of speech doesn't matter because certain people have more power. So what you were saying earlier. But what they were presenting was the Skokie situation as just, look how terrible this is. And that's as far as the argument goes in terms of why they shouldn't be defended, because they're ultimately Nazis. And it's really hard to argue against that, not necessarily because they're correct, but because you look really bad trying to defend that side. And so I'm worried that already there's a PR issue with defending freedom of speech because of that. But also within the past, I don't know, 5-10 years, I'm not too sure, I feel like it's becoming now overwhelmingly people associate it with being a right-wing issue, where when people think of freedom of speech, they think of, well, it's usually the conservatives defending freedom of speech. And so whenever there's something going on in the news about freedom of speech and people defending it, a lot of people, I feel like, kind of just brush that aside, don't think it's a big issue, because they think it's more of a right-wing thing. That's something that they care about, even though I would argue that the concept of freedom of speech is completely, devoid of being a right-wing issue, or I mean, maybe a left-wing issue, but ultimately it should be bipartisan. It's just freedom of speech. In fact, people like socialists are probably the type of people who would want to defend freedom of speech the most, because it's not just something that you can kind of view as a principle based on equality, but also it's a good tool. It's a good tool to adjudicate disputes without resorting to violence. It's a very useful tool. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on, do you think that there is a strong association between the right wing and conservatism? And if so, how do we disentangle uh, the freedom of speech being associated with a political side?
Well, thank you so much, Vern. You actually made 2 points. I mean, before you asked the question, which I definitely want to answer, you were describing the Skokie case and a common argument against protecting freedom of speech in that case, which is, look how horrible the message is. And this gets back to a point I made earlier, and I said can never be stressed enough, which is you are never defending the message. You are defending the right of a person to express his or her own ideas, and for audience members to choose to listen to those ideas or to refute them or to ignore them or to protest them. And you know, it's so common that the arguments against freedom for hateful or disinformation or extremist or any other kind of controversial expression starts and stops with the supposed harm of the expression. And I want to say supposed harm because let's not forget that even, arguably, especially the most evil message we have gained something from hearing it. My dear friend and co-author and colleague Greg Lukianoff stresses this over and over again as what he sees as the indisputable value of every expression, especially the most loathsome, and that is the informational value. If people have those ideas, it is really helpful for us to know that they have those ideas, to know that anti-Semitism is still a potent force in our society. And by the way, law enforcement officials are often very opposed to censorship of hate speech and extremist speech and terrorist speech, because then those people who have those ideas are driven to the dark web where they're only communicating with each other. Their views become more and more extreme, and it's much harder for law enforcement to actually monitor their communications to look for evidence of actual plots of actual violence. So, and this is leading to another major point, which is even assuming for the sake of argument that a certain type of expression just based on its viewpoint is irredeemably harmful, that alone cannot logically possibly justify censoring it, because we would have to ask whether the censorship is going to be effective in reducing the harm, or whether, in fact, it might be counterproductive, whether it might do more harm than good. And there are so many reasons for reaching the latter conclusion, including the so-called forbidden fruits phenomenon, that the best way to get more attention to a controversial idea or speaker is to try to suppress it. You know, that just arouses curiosity and even sympathy on the part of many observers. So, you know, again, if we the so-called thinking that is reflected in these arguments, either dropping a slogan, as Bruce gave a very common example, or starting and stopping the analysis with the harm that the speech causes without also taking into account the harm that the censorship causes, is just not a rational way of addressing a social issue. Now, for the particular point that you asked about, Vern, whether free speech has come to be too much associated with conservatives, again, as I said earlier, that's really not factually accurate. I think the reason people have that misconception is because so many campuses, which have become a big center of the focus of discussion on free speech. And as has been demonstrated by a lot of data, campuses tend to be very much to the left of the political spectrum, very much unrepresentative of American society as a whole. And if you look at certain parts of the country, certain states, certain cities or areas, mostly rural areas in every state, including even the most generally progressive states, such as New York, where I live, there are areas where liberal ideas are extremely unpopular and are subject to censorship. I was mentioned that John Rauch and I, another one of your guests, were having an email exchange right before I began this podcast interview, and he pointed out a new development in Texas where a faculty member at Texas A&M was fired because of saying that, and it was a class about something to do with human sexuality. And the professors asserted that there are more than two genders and was fired for saying that. That is not a conservative perspective that professor was fired for. And I just recently spoke in Florida, and long before Trump became president, legislation signed into law by Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida basically outlawed any discussion in kindergarten through 12th grade, as well as at the university level, discussion of issues about race or gender that, were divisive, that were unpatriotic. And you have faculty members now feeling that they can't teach critical race theory at all. They can't teach the 1619 Project. I'm not saying that these are flawless ideas. They should be counterbalanced with criticism and other perspectives. But to have the government come in and censor that, again, we're talking about ideas that are and perspectives that are cherished by the left that have been suppressed in Florida. A lot of people will remember the law was called the Stop Woke Act. So anything that was seen as woke progressivism becomes illegal, not only in Florida, but in many other states, and now nationally, thanks to some executive orders by Donald Trump. So especially after Donald Trump has become president, anybody who thinks that it's conservative ideas and speakers who are bearing the brunt of censorship hasn't been paying attention to the news. Trump didn't come to punish Harvard and Columbia and Brown and Cornell and so forth because he thought that they were engaging in conservative speech. Quite the opposite. It was what he sees as woke left progressive ideology that is bringing about unprecedented amounts of censorship. And then I also mentioned on the Gaza Israel-Palestine debates, there has been a lot of censorship all over the ideological spectrum there, but certainly from the Trump administration and for many campuses, it's anything that is seen as even arguably anti-Semitic, which is anything that, is being misinterpreted as anything that is critical of Israel or critical of particular policies by the Netanyahu administration in Israel. So anybody who used to think that censorship is only a concern of the right just has really not been paying attention to the most dramatic recent, not even that recent developments in the past couple of years.
I want to turn the conversation slightly now to the one injunction we actually do have against free speech, and that's the idea of incitement to violence. But again, this is an idea that has concept fudge. There have been attempts in the past on both the left and the right to fold speech under the umbrella of violence so it can be put aside. Now, I've always understood "quote unquote" incitement to violence as, and I'll give a comical example to illustrate what I think about it. What I think it means. We imagine someone in a crowd. This individual grabs a microphone, a megaphone or whatever, and they point their finger at someone in the crowd or a group of people and starts screaming, "Get him!" which is a direct incitement to violence, or probably in enaction of what you spoke of earlier, called the emergency principle. As of late, we've been seeing a lot of filthy content posted out by individuals on some very, very terrible podcasts. I'll leave out the name of this one for right now, but like I've seen a podcast in which we've seen people making flat out racist and bigoted remarks against Jews, with some saying like they belong in gas chambers, someone has to quote unquote do something, or even outrightly saying that they kill them. Now, all of that is rightly called hate speech. I'm not denying that at all. But like what I'm struggling with is the idea is that this dialogue itself is a direct incitement to violence. Now, I agree that it can lead to some terrible things, but I get behind the idea that it's direct incitement. We've seen organizations like the ACLU defend Nazis and other hate groups before, and I can't imagine that these groups.
Again, this is an important qualification, Bruce. Sure. We do not defend the organizations, or we defend their rights to free speech.
Of course, okay? Of course. My apologies.
And I think no, don't apologize. These shorthands gloss over a really important distinction, and I understand what you're saying, but to underscore points that both of you and I have made, we are never defending anything about the organization, including its philosophy. All we are defending is their First Amendment right, first of all, to express ideas. Secondly, to form an organization. That's also a First Amendment right, freedom of association.
Well, I'll be sure to make that qualification in the future, because that's a very, very important distinction you point out. Thank you. But my question is, that idea of incitement to violence, that itself is being fudged over. So what does it truly mean to be an incitement to violence in order for it to qualify as saying, no, this speech is unacceptable? Yes, it is one of the few injunctions we support against free speech.
It's a wonderful, important question, and what you are talking about is an example of a type of speech that satisfies this context-based emergency principle. And there are a couple others, Bruce, which I would be happy to talk about. But this one is quite well known and, again, often misstated. It was agreed the very tight, specific, narrow definition of constitutionally unprotected incitement was agreed upon by the Supreme Court unanimously in 1969 in an ACLU case in which we defended freedom of speech in a case that happened to involve the KKK. But the very next time the Supreme Court enforced this concept, it was on behalf of a speaker with exactly the opposite anti-racist message, namely a leader of the NAACP. So I thought that was very poetic that, completely opposite speakers with completely opposite messages were protected by the extremely narrow definition of unprotected incitement. And it's important because it was in that 1969 case that the Supreme Court definitively rejected the former loose bad tendency test and insisted on this tight, direct causal connection between the speech and the harm, consistent with the emergency principle. So here's the test. First of all, the Supreme Court said that, and it used the adjective mere before the word advocacy. Mere advocacy, even of violence, even of lawlessness, is never punishable. Let me strike the double negatives. That mere advocacy, even of great violence and great lawlessness, is constitutionally protected. The only time it crosses the line and becomes constitutionally punishable is if it's not advocacy, but incitement. So the Supreme Court was using the word incitement to mean something much more specific and narrow than advocacy. So, some of the examples you gave, Bruce, I think Jews should go to the gas chamber, even if that, first of all, I think that's probably just a mere opinion, and opinions are always protected. The Supreme Court has said under the Constitution, there's no such thing as a false idea. But even if somebody went further and said, I think that, we should send Jews to the gas chamber, that's advocacy, that's protected. But to be unprotected, the Supreme Court said it has to be intent. So I'm going to list every factor. Intentional incitement of imminent violence or lawlessness that is likely to actually happen imminently. And all 5 of those criteria must be satisfied. Not only was that Supreme Court decision unanimous, but 1969 was a long time ago. We've had many Supreme Court justices since then, many decisions involving these issues since then. And despite the huge ideological differences among those justices, every single one of them has supported that extremely narrow, I think appropriately narrow concept of punishable incitement. And let me tell you, the last time that the ACLU went to the Supreme Court just a few years ago, arguing against punishment of a speaker on the ground that it did not satisfy this narrow standard of punishable incitement, our client was D. Ray McKesson, a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement, who was punished in Louisiana. It wasn't New Orleans, another city in Louisiana. I'm sorry, forgetting exactly where it was. But he was speaking to a Black Lives Matter rally. There had been a recent murder of a police officer. I'm sorry, let me back that up. There had been a recent killing by police officers of Black man who was, either innocent or it wasn't clear whether there was any justification for the violence. And there was a lot of anger against the police because of what was believed to be unjustified violence against a Black person. And so there was very heated rhetoric denouncing the police as racist and as violent. And, we have to, take some action against this. And in the rally, somebody threw a brick or a brick-like object at a police officer and injured that police officer. Now, of course, the person who threw the brick is culpable. Of course, they never found the person, to the best of my knowledge. But a punitive action was also brought against D. Ray McKesson and the Black Lives Matter organization, arguing that they were responsible for instigating the brick thrower, and therefore they should be punished severely for having caused this great harm to the police officer. And fortunately, the Supreme Court reaffirmed this strict test. I don't remember if I said the name of the case was Brandenburg versus Ohio. Clarence Brandenburg was the KKK leader. But guess what? Brandenburg comes to the defense of D. Ray McKesson and Black Lives Matter.
I think this is probably...
I'm so sorry, but Bruce is looking puzzled again. As a teacher, I like the opportunity to engage with that puzzlement.
It's not
trying to digest what I'm saying. Right?
I get this all the time whenever light bulbs come on because of the quality of the dialogue we have in the speaker. And
you don't have a poker face, right?
No, I don't. And I hope I get a chance to meet in person in the future, because this is just a feature of mine that I just have. And whenever I'm just engaged with someone who just brings up these incredible points and angles I just haven't considered before, I get dragged along by a fish hook and saying, "Wow, this is a really interesting angle that we're exploring this from." So. It's not puzzlement, it's fascination.
Oh, thank you. But please never hesitate to ask follow-ups. I mean, Greg and I were deliberately, and I do in all of my speaking, I mean, I often, if people will say, how should we publicize it? And I often say, well, put on the poster or the email or whatever, tools of marketing you're using. Please come with your toughest questions about free speech, because it's the way, you have to be open-minded, right? To truly believe in free speech, you have to be open to reconsidering it. It's kind of a paradox, but
Nadine, if I come here with every single question I have about free speech, this podcast will never end. So.
One of the things that one of the arguments that I found interesting on the other side, the oppositional side, is this idea that as times change, so do our conceptions of rights, of our conceptions of our civil duties. And so for example, one of the big ones was the concept of like liberty, the whole debate between the old liberals and the new liberals. When we think about freedom, are we only talking about negative freedoms, freedom from the government forcing us to do certain things? Or are we also talking about positive freedoms, right? Someone who's born wealthy has more freedom to do something in society than someone born impoverished. And so one of the arguments against freedom of speech is the idea that the times that we are in now, it kind of requires also some level, there has to be something more added to our concept of free speech. So for example, someone who is incredibly powerful, influential, they might have an audience, their freedom of speech, the power that their freedom of speech has will always necessarily be stronger, more powerful, more influential, more noteworthy than, someone who, someone like me, right? So and I think this is one of the arguments that they said against someone, Milo Yiannopoulos. So Milo Yiannopoulos, very famous provocateur, who was, I think the campus was UCSB, the University of California, Santa Barbara, in which he was shouted down by a lot of protesters. And the argument there was that, well, Milo Yiannopoulos, his freedom of speech, when he says something, millions of people will hear, and that's very powerful. The trans voices or minority voices that he's attacking have a much smaller voice. So when he's getting shouted down at some venue, it's not him getting his freedom of speech taken away, but rather it's a leveling of the playing field. And so the person argues that I read this from, it's actually the same person, P.E. Moskowitz. They argue that when we think about freedom of speech, it's not just freedom to say what you want without the government interfering, but we have to also add on to that a concept of power, of influence, something that isn't just, strictly, if you say something you won't get in trouble, that's fine. There has to be something more to it. I'm curious what your response to that is. Do you think we should change our understanding of freedom of speech to include power, to include all these, other factors? Or is that more of a separate issue? We should focus on them, but it's kind of a separate issue.
Well, let me start first. Again, another really important question. Let me start first by questioning the factual assumption, even in the example that you gave, Vern. Who had more power in that situation? Was it the speaker who got shouted down, or was it the anonymous mob of supposedly powerless students who silenced him and therefore were depriving not only him of the right to convey his ideas, but also the right of members of the audience who wanted to hear him, who might well have included members of the audience who really disliked his ideas, but wanted to understand what they were so that they could more effectively refute them. In this era of social media, one influencer who sets off a chain reaction of viral, cancel messages can bring down formerly, or ostensibly people with great power in terms of their economic well-being, in terms of their position. We've seen heads of corporations and, executives and media leaders lose their jobs and because of just anonymous, ordinary people who are taking to the internet. And I think one of the reasons why the ACLU so strongly, and if I may say so, consequentially defended freedom for the internet when it was new and everybody wanted to censor it, all across the political spectrum. That's a story for another podcast here. But one of the reasons was because the internet, certainly combined with mobile phone technology, is essentially enabling potentially every single member of the human race to communicate rapidly with essentially every other member of the human race. Back in the middle of the 20th century, a cynical journalist said, I think quite accurately, raising the argument that you were paraphrasing, Vern. He said, the freedom of the press belongs only to those who are rich enough to afford to buy a printing press. But thanks to mobile technology and online communications, as the Supreme Court said in a couple of its online free speech cases, basically most people now can afford to have a printing press in the palm of their hands. That's more powerful than, the most powerful traditional media. But that segues into another point, and the point that I agree with you is complementary to free speech. It is not enough to simply rely on it as a negative, thou shalt not. If our goal is, and mine certainly is, and it's certainly the goal of the ACLU and of FIRE, to make freedom of speech not only a restraint on government restrictions, but an affirmative opportunity, meaningful opportunity for everybody equally to enjoy and participate in the marketplace of ideas, to engage in self-expression, which is important to be able to communicate with others, to be able to communicate with and about politicians and government officials so that we can participate actively and as engaged and equal citizens in our democratic republic. Then we have to take affirmative steps to make sure that those opportunities are as equally available as possible. And that means through public education. It means through public access to communications technology, to access to the internet, and so forth. But I want to say that this kind of problem or challenge of making sure that a constitutional right is equally available to everybody, that's a problem that exists with respect to every single constitutional right. And I think I used this example in The War on Words. I wrote it a while ago. You probably read it more recently than I have, you two, so you can tell me. But that take the right to life itself, the right to be free from unconstitutional deprivation of life through the death penalty, which is still constitutional in the United States. Every single study will show, and I don't know anybody who dissents, that you control for every other factor, seriousness of the crime and premeditation and past record and so forth, that the single determinative factor is not, by the way, race, which is a factor, but the most important factor is wealth. And, one prison warden said, why do we call it capital punishment when the only people who get it are the ones who don't have capital? And I I have the most enormous respect for overworked public defenders, but they're under-resourced. They are stretched thin. They simply cannot do the same kind of job in fighting against even unjustified claims of prosecution for capital crimes as wealthy defendants can do with their access to the best lawyers, the dream team, the key witnesses, the investigation, and so forth. And so the answer to that is, well, let's execute more rich people and powerful people as well as poor people. No, let's make more resources available so that the poor people can mount an equivalent defense. And it's the same thing with free speech. Let's not suppress the voice of people who happen to be rich, but let's amplify the voices of those who are not, including through development and distribution of technologies that are accessible to everybody, and the education to be able to use them effectively.
One of our mutual and very good friends and good people, Mr. Angel Eduardo, one of my favorite people. He's been a solid voice of reason and someone whose thoughts I very, very much value when it comes to the world we currently live in. He wrote an article a while back asking whether or not Twitter is a truly a quote unquote public sphere. Now, there's a lot of debate about this. And it is a privately owned platform, but there's an argument that social media has become too powerful. And the argument is that it has to be regulated like a public utility. Earlier this year, when I was at a conference, Dr. Machangama stated that he showed several examples of Elon Musk manipulating Twitter as his own personal platform for speech that he prefers. There's been arguments about like you need terms of service for these kinds of platforms to prevent it from being turned into an online sewer of just despicable activity. But this really illustrates the idea as to whether or not these new social media platforms, which is all new technology in the 21st century, we're not sure what to make of it, how to utilize it, how to regulate it according to principles we hold dear, like freedom of speech, and the effects it has in the world. So I guess my question is Twitter a public square?
It is a public square in the sense that it is an important platform, or it has been an important platform for people to exchange ideas, similar to a traditional public square or public park. But that is a different question from should it be treated as a regulated public utility. Because there are many other examples of platforms that are privately owned, where people come together to engage in expressive activities. Probably the most common before the advent of social media were shopping malls, which used to be major gathering places. That's changed as a result of a number of developments, including the advent of social media. But the Supreme Court ultimately held that the private property owner cannot be forced to allow any speaker on any topic, that violates the free speech rights of the property owner, and that whether the property is a shopping mall or a social media platform, the free speech right includes the right to decide what speakers and ideas you are going to host and which you're not going to host. And I think you can very well identify with that. I have no First Amendment right to be on your podcast, much as I might want to. You have a First Amendment right as editors and curators to decide whom you're going to invite. And, this, in a way, it gets back to a point that you raised right at the beginning, Vern, which is even though there are First Amendment rights on the part of the platform owner, in this case, Twitter, and no First Amendment rights vis-a-vis the platform owner on the part of anybody who's seeking access to the platform, maybe we ought to raise our First Amendment rights or raise our voices under the First Amendment to try to persuade platform owners to adopt certain speech protective policies. And certainly that's what's done through advertising boycotts, through consumer boycotts. I understand that a lot of people that used to be on Twitter have moved off Twitter. They're exercising their freedom of speech, but taking their voices elsewhere. And maybe that would ultimately affect, if not Elon Musk, a subsequent owner of Twitter. But again, the answer to speech you don't like, which includes curatorial or editorial decisions by platform owners, the answer is not to somehow restrict the free speech rights of that platform owner, but to have more speech. Hopefully more new platforms will come along. And I understand, I don't follow this that closely, but I think like Blue Sky is an alternative. And, in the ideal world from a free speech point of view, we would have multiple options of platforms, and we could each choose the one that accorded the most with our own preferences. Another option that has been advocated by digital rights experts, and here the organization whose work I consider most useful is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, because they combine First Amendment expertise with technological expertise, which I certainly lack. But they have long advocated interoperability so that and portability, so that you would not be trapped into staying with the same social media platform because it's too hard to transfer your data. But rather, the new legislation could, in a content neutral way, simply require that the data be portable and that each user could choose screening preferences and algorithmic preferences, and wouldn't be subject to whatever the uniform choices were by a particular platform owner. So to me, that's a much more speech protective and user empowerment approach that would achieve the same goal, I think, much better than a public monopoly or public utility approach. One of my friends and colleagues whose work I also really admire in this area, Eugene Volokh, who's now at the Hoover Institution. Until recently, he was a law professor at UCLA. He said that he's never seen a problem that government couldn't make worse through regulation. So again, it's like, yeah, there's a downside to letting these tech titans have their way, but we have to say, as compared to what? Maybe government regulation is going to have even more of a downside.
Couldn't agree more. Well, Nadine, thank you so much for joining us. It was absolutely delightful to have you on, and we really couldn't be honored, anymore to have you on. So thank you so much, truly.
I feel the same way about both of you. Thank you for your really important and influential and interesting exercise of your free speech rights.
And the links to everything will be in the description of the video below. So I highly recommend everyone go check out 10 Arguments Against The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. I highly recommend it. It's 10 arguments in total. And I would say they're they're the 10 most frequent arguments that I've come across, as well as the 10 strongest ones I've come across. So I would argue that you will be well equipped to defend freedom of speech by reading that book, thinking about it, thinking it over, taking it to heart. And so we really appreciate you. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Good night. Thanks to both of you, Bruce and Vern.